Good afternoon. I'm Lynella Hooper-Williams, member of the PRSA New Jersey Board and D&I Committee. Thanks everyone for joining us. We have over 400 people registered for this webinar. You just witnessed a humorous but common act of implicit bias in the video, and that's exactly what today's Lunch and Learn is focused on. This webinar represents the fourth in the series of PRSA's Courageous Conversations. You can check out the on-demand videos of the other webinars on our YouTube channel. Before we get started, I really want to give a shout out to the YMCA State Alliance for their support of the webinar series. We really appreciate your support. I also want to thank the other diversity and inclusion committee members. We have been working very hard at trying to bring the best content to you. And just a few housekeeping notes. Everyone has been placed on mute by the host. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function instead of the chat. At the end of the webinar, we will reserve about 15 minutes for questions. And if you want to engage with each other, please use the chat. This is a safe space for people to respectfully express their opinions and to have those opinions respected by others. So please be mindful of this as you use the chat function to share your thoughts and comments. At this point, I'd like to turn the virtual stage over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Darren Anderson. Dr. Darren Anderson will be moderating the panel today. Thank you. Darren?
Thank you, Lynella, and thank you to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for inviting me to be the moderator for today's conversation. I want to introduce my esteemed panelists, and then we're going to share a few other items with you. Today we have with us, we have Autumn Latimore. Autumn is the Director of Customer Communications at Pfizer. And she also has more than 25 years of proven leadership and strategic experience in integrated communications, marketing, public relations, and community relations. Our next panelist, friend and a colleague of mine, we have Lynda Gonzales-Chavez. Lynda is the Senior Vice President and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion and Global Officer for the YMCA of the USA. Lynda is responsible for leading the Y in our strategic priority to ensure that all segments of society have access to and feel welcome at the Y. And last but not least, we have our other esteemed colleague here with us, Cole Brown. Cole is an associate at Boston Consulting Group and author of Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World. Cole currently lives in Sydney, Australia, and sometimes he's in New York, but he has joined us from Australia. So let's thank Cole for spending his time here with us, as well as Lynda and as well as Autumn. Before we proceed, and Teresa, if you can fast forward the next slide. Cole has been gracious enough to provide some books for us for Greyboy. And we just wanted to share today that we have a few that have already won these books. So we have Lisa Bach. Lisa was the first person to register for this webinar series, so thank you. Our first PRSA member is Megan Gross. Our first YMCA member is Jessica Mateo from Metro YMCA. And the organization with the most registrants is the Greater Monmouth County YMCA. So I'm sure I'll be hearing from Laura Goganzer soon. And we will make sure that all of you get a copy of your books. And if you need to send your email address or any way to get in contact with you, please send a chat to the host. We have a poll that we're going to share with you all. We want to ask all of you to take time to complete this poll regarding the questions that's going to be before you. These questions are pertinent to the conversation that we're going to be having today, and we want to engage with you, but we also want to learn from you as well. We're all down-to-earth people, and we all want to be able to not only have conversation with you, but we want to make sure that any of your ideas or your thoughts or just some of your concerns may be covered in some of our conversation here. So please take your time to complete the poll. We have more than 200 participants here with us, so thank you. We know that, as Lynda stated earlier, we have over 400 that has registered, so we're quite certain that more of our colleagues will be joining us throughout this segment. As the polls are being answered, we want to do some grounding for today's conversation. And so, Teresa, if you can reshare the slide.
Is it launched?
All righty. So we just wanted to start off with a definition. We realize that, you know, anybody can Google and anyone can go to the Webster, but we wanted to find a common definition in which most of our content and conversation will be surrounded. So implicit bias, we're saying it's the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Also, the definition of microaggressions, we can advance the slide, is the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So those are going to be the two definitions in which most of our conversation and our dialogue will be surrounding. So I'm not sure if the poll is ready to be shared, Teresa. If not, we can share it upon, yes, we are sharing it currently. And so as we are taking a look at this poll, we're seeing that many people have experienced microaggressions regarding age, regarding their sex, regarding their race and ethnicity and nationality, and as well as gender. So with that said, let's go ahead and begin our conversation with our esteemed panelists. So let me throw the first question out to you all. You know, what are some examples of the microaggressions that you all have experienced or observed? And let's start with you, Autumn.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, thank you, Doctor. Wow, so I would say the granddaddy of them all is you are so articulate. And while that may have a wonderful initial intent, it comes across as, well, I didn't think that you as a Black person would be articulate, or you as an Asian person would speak the King's English, so to speak, King's English. And I don't know why that wouldn't be, right? So I had done kind of an informal poll on Facebook, and the amount of pouring in of comments was unreal. Just the number of people who spoke about the different aggressions that they experience on a daily basis, it blew my mind. And it wasn't Black people, it was Asian folks, it was gay friends, it was transgender people, you name it. And there were so many microaggressions that they experienced in their lives.
Yeah. Lynda.
So thank you, Dr. Anderson. For myself, as I identify as a Latina or a Mexican American, and the number of conversations and stereotypes that have been presented, like I didn't know Mexicans were born in the United States. So where are your people from? When I talk about New Mexico didn't become a state until 1912, they just don't know the history of it. And so there's all these stereotypes there. I think for a lot of native Spanish speakers, I think that happens a lot to them, including it happened my whole life to my parents. My parents' first language was Spanish, but they were born and raised in New Mexico. And so some of those particular things. I also remember one colleague of mine, we do a lot of work with our new immigrants. And one of our senior vice presidents at the time was an immigrant from Latin America. And we were doing some flip chart writing, and there was a misspelling, and the facilitator said, "Oh, this must have been, I'll call him Don. This must have been Don, that made the mistake." And of course it wasn't him. He was written perfect English, but it was just those kind of things. And then just lastly, I'm also I'm 4'11", and people constantly come up to me and like, "You're so small. I didn't know you were so small," or "You didn't look that small from this space." But oftentimes in a professional setting, I don't know if people want their appearance to be called out in that way, but it happens to me constantly. It's one example.
Well, Lynda, I understand that as well. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I'm 6'7", so there are many times where there are assumptions that have been made, whether it's a sports related or it's some type of other maybe barbaric game. So yes, I completely understand what you're sharing with us. Cole, what have you experienced?
Well, as everyone has said, thank you for having me. I think that there's a few. One, the comment, "You are so articulate," or "You are so articulate," resonates with me in a major way. I hear that often, particularly given the fact that these days I speak in public quite often, and I think that people are just a bit too impressed that I'm able to string sentences together in the way that I am, and it makes me a bit uncomfortable at times. Two, I think that there is a fascination with how low I keep my hair. That has always been strange to me. Doctor, maybe this resonates with you. But I will often get comments, and even people workplace, people wanting to like rub my head. That's just strange. And the fascination there is totally undue in my opinion. And then finally, I'm calling you, as you mentioned, from Sydney, Australia. And so I get sort of an interesting nationality implicit bias that people probably don't assume. There's an assumption of a brashness around Americans that I don't think that I kind of fit into. But it's often sort of perceived that I would or should or that's expected of me. And I run into that in the workplace pretty regularly.
Yeah. Well, Cole, one of the good things about being tall, if somebody did want to decide they want to touch, go ahead and go. So maybe that's a factor. But how does the microaggressions and this implicit bias, how does it show up in the workplace and within organizations? Autumn, you want to take a shot at that question?
Sure. Myriad of ways. I'll give you a wonderful example where my manager happens to be African-American woman, and didn't know her, just applied for the job, got the job. But the people who were on the team, we were having a discussion maybe about 3 or 4 months after I joined, and they made the point of saying, "Hey, make sure you don't say anything to, our boss, because I know you're friends with her." And I'm like, why would you assume that I'm friends with her? But they said, well, and they didn't go in and say what they were thinking or what they really wanted to say, but it was very obvious that because we were both African American, they assumed that there was a certain amount of familiarity that went past professionalism, perhaps. And they felt that the confidentiality would be completely marred because I would run right back and tell my best buddy, who happened to be another Black woman. And, unacceptable. I said, I don't know her other than as our boss, and didn't get to know her until 3 months ago. So I don't think that would be the implication, but that to me is that is a bias that we experience quite a bit in the workplace as African Americans, that there's an affinity automatically. And not that that's wrong, but that's an issue whenever you assume that there's a certain amount of distrust attached to it, right? So that would be a huge one. And I'd say another would be age, and on both sides of the age spectrum. So I've heard people say, well, you know, this is like a Love Boat reference. And they'll turn to the millennials in the room and say, you guys probably don't know what that means. Or the other side, the millennials will mention maybe, you know, a reference to the latest rap song. And there's an assumption, well, I know probably everybody doesn't get this because, you know, it's newer. You know, there are so many different assumptions that we make. And I think we have to be really, really careful and empathetic and mindful of how we approach topics. It's just about being vigilant.
You know, we had that conversation as we were preparing for today. And, you know, we, talked to Cole kind of about that. We said that there's microaggressions regarding age, there's microaggressions regarding generations, you know, and Cole, prior to writing your book, you know, you were kind of interacting with your organization and kind of working as a consultant throughout this global world. You know, what's your thoughts regarding this?
Yeah, I think that as you mentioned, I was an associate. I've been that whole time, but I have a mix about that. In terms of the person that was just mentioned, I'm not entirely sure I would catch a Love Boat reference. I'm 25 years old, but I think that there are moments where, particularly as the youngest person in the room, in a consulting environment that frames itself as an apprenticeship, I think it's hard even for me at times to decipher whether what I am running up against is implicit bias, or frankly just I'm the young kid in the room and I need to kind of take crap for a while in order to get to the next level. And that's a cultural element that exists within organizations. I think that is not always as a factor of discrimination, and more just sort of culturally, you know, the what's happening, what's been put together there. So that form of implicit bias, I'm frankly not always sure where I come down on. The one that I am much more prepared to identify often is around my own race, and then also, as I mentioned, is around my nationality as well.
And thank you for that, Cole. And Lynda, if I can kind of add a dualism for you, you know, how does this show up not only in the workplace and organizations, but the YMCA, and you're leading our effort that we have made a commitment to become an anti-racist organization. So how does, you know, these microaggressions or implicit biases also can show up in the community?
Right, exactly. So organizationally, we've really had to look at our history as a YMCA. Because we started out as a very exclusive organization, the Young Men's Christian Association. You can imagine all the layers of microaggressions that can happen in that space, whether it be when one of our women CEOs shows up to a community event and they find that she's a woman, or our African-American CEOs as they show up into the community. So we're constantly aware of that, and recognizing that we needed to move ourselves historically since our founding from being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant organization to even be relevant in communities today. There's some really interesting examples that we've had to work on. As you know, Dr. Darren, much of our work had to be scaling up our leaders to engage in community and to know those communities that they're serving. An example would be one that wouldn't come to mind quite often, which is we were not getting the responses in the south side of Chicago, for example, from Catholics, because they still saw us as a Protestant organization. So how we were able to even just start engaging in that space was really important. Our work with different populations of color, including Hispanic, Latino, new immigrants, Asian Pacific Islanders, is some of the assumptions that organizations like ours can make, that those folks don't have the resources to become full YMCA members, but that we need to go to them for social services, for example. We've really been having to focus on that we can't make assumptions that because of somebody's race or ethnicity, that also is an overlay to other dimensions of diversity. So it really is a journey, and preparing our folks for things that they don't know. How are we able to, as an organization focused in community, facilitate dialogues that address not knowing what you don't know, and to reclaim the concept of ignorance and create safe and brave spaces for people to ask questions, just like what we're doing here today. How are we able to ask questions? If we're not able to do this in these type of forums where our organizations come together to have this type of a dialogue, how are we going to do this kind of work in the communities we serve or in the markets that we serve?
You know, you're absolutely right, Lynda, regarding communities, because many times, and when we think about microaggressions, you can, you know, give a zip code or you can give a name of a community, and many times we have this kind of visceral reaction. And sometimes this visceral reaction is based off of what we may have seen in the media or what someone else experienced and they shared with you, but never have ever stepped foot in that community. And a lot of our work, especially at the urban level, we're taking a deeper dive and you know, there's looking for positive outcomes, but also we recognize that if you come in with a preconceived notion, then many times that can kind of interact in a way in the community that's not received very well.
Right.
And then the impact that you want to have simply doesn't take place. So now let's take this conversation where my grandfather would say, let's get it to the level where the goats can get it, can understand it. Why are these not compliments? Why what you just shared with us are not compliments if the person on the other end that's saying these things think that it is? Autumn?
Well, I would say that it becomes an acknowledgement of perhaps a negative or something that might be held against me. So, for example, if you say, when I see you, I don't see color. So that implies to me that you don't want to acknowledge my Blackness as a positive per se, and that you won't hold it against me, as opposed to it being a data point about me as a person. You know, it's okay to say, you know what, I've had white friends that'll say, oh, well, you know, you'll recognize Autumn. She has on glasses and she's tall, and you know, she uses her hands a lot. You can say that she's also African American or Black. That's okay. There's no value judgment in describing me, but the value judgment comes in our bias, right? So that's why it's important that we really ensure that as we are talking about people or to people, that we are aware of how they might be perceived, but also how we're delivering the message, right? And that it might end up being something that's not as positive. I hope that answers the question.
Well, you know, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone else, you know, may have their individual question on why something that would be perceived or is a microaggression, but yet, you know, those that's delivering it may think it is a compliment. So I'm going to go to you, Lynda, give you an opportunity. I'm going to come back to you, Cole, because I have something specific for you.
So as Autumn shared, it's as people start getting to know each other and relationships are built, I think a lot of these conversations become easier. It's about building those relationships and coming into the space and asking for grace or brave conversation or honesty to have that. But if somebody gets called out for something that brings a hyper magnifying glass to them in a professional setting, that gets uncomfortable for anybody, right? But there's ways for us to find opportunities for these conversations. And so, you know, Dr. Darren, some of our basic nuts and bolts trainings allow these types of conversations to take place, so that we began dialoguing related to that, because we also come into these spaces as individuals And one individual may be very sensitive about one particular dimension of diversity and how that gets addressed, where for another person it may not be as such. So how do you begin recognizing that and moving from ignorance into processes that helps build that knowledge? So as we were talking in preparations, the Harvard Implicit Association tests, the IAT tests, there's all types of bias. And sometimes we just have to take time ourselves to start recognizing our own biases and how we show up so that we can continue having these conversations at an organizational level. So how do we look at building individual capacity around a really difficult conversation like microaggressions, and how do we start moving that learning into organizational embeddedness? So we start having these places and these safe spaces where we can all get better collectively at engaging with one another in a very multicultural society that we all live in. And how do we begin to look at the impact of social media, for example, as a primary driver of information, and we don't value those people, the relationships that we have with real lived experience as an information. You know, YMCA of the USA's offices are in Chicago, and for all of us, the reactions that we get, you know, related to Chicago is only one dimension of what a very complex city is all about.
If I could just jump in to piggyback on that, I would say that we also have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable to some extent, and maybe being corrected by someone in hopefully a thoughtful way. But I think it's about us learning from experience and rethinking some of those biases and being challenged by them, and keeping in mind that intent does not trump the impact. You know, you may have a positive impact. You know, I didn't mean anything by that. Maybe you didn't, but this is now your chance to learn that it did impact someone, and it might impact people in general in a very direct way. And microaggressions have been said to be like death by 1,000 cuts, right? There's just this ongoing, constant, you know, little things. I remember one time when I was dressed in a suit, very, you know, professional, had my laptop in my hand. I get on the elevator of a common office building, going up to one of our floors that we shared, and a smaller white lady moved over. There's only two of us on the elevator, huge elevator, moves over to the corner and holds her purse closer. I mean, do I look like I'm gonna, you know, take your purse? Or, but it was her bias and her not being willing to be uncomfortable. So, I mean, nothing was said in that sense, but my point is that, you know, it's about us learning to understand that intent doesn't necessarily affect the impact the same way. I mean, they could be very small, but have a very large impact. I mean, this is years later, and I still remember that. So I think that's a huge part about us accepting and also walking into the process and being able to hone our relationships so that we can ask those questions, quite frankly, of each other.
And Autumn, and I'm so glad that you shared that with us, that, you know, microaggressions are received differently. You know, many of us may be able to allow those microaggressions to bounce off our shoulders or off our back and don't necessarily think twice about it. But others, it become internalized. And it may manifest itself in a particular way, whether you begin to shut down or you don't necessarily communicate or make yourself available to those within your organization or within your work environment. So the impact can be tremendous. And speaking of that impact, you know, Cole, you know, a recent author of Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World. This book that you wrote, what was the reason you wrote the book, and what was kind of your desired outcome?
You know, the book started, as I mentioned, I'm a somewhat recent graduate. I graduated in 2018 from Georgetown, and it started as an essay while I was at Georgetown. And it stemmed from emotions that I think were created via all of the things we're talking about, microaggressions and expectations of one's abilities or character stemming from their race. I grew up as a Black kid, largely pretty much exclusively in white spaces. I was often, and still to this day am often, the only Black person in the room. And found that my version of Blackness, the way that I experienced my own Blackness, my identity, was not reflected in that environment whatsoever. You know, I grew up in the early 2000s, and I grew up in Philly, and I write about in the book that in the early 2000s in Philly, for a young boy at an all-boys school, the definition of manhood and the definition of Blackness in many ways was Allen Iverson. A killer on the basketball court, tattooed, had a rap career. I love Allen Iverson, but I knew that my version of Black manhood was not Allen Iverson from an early age. So the book is largely about running up against many of the interactions we're talking about, microaggressions stemming from, you know, misappropriated expectations about who I should be, and then also not so microaggressions as well that come up in those younger years. I think the impact that I'm hoping to have with the book, hopefully through people reading it, but also through conversations like this, is expanding that definition just ever so slightly. You know, we understand that Blackness is a very broad identity, that it is not a monolith, that it contains varied people, and I think that the impact that I hope for is to add just one small facet to what is a very broad identity, in terms of our common understanding of it.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that, Cole. A question for all three of you. How should we deal with microaggressions, whether it's being peer mediated, whether it is kind of a sounding board of an organization and they need to be confronted with this, or even in your individual workspace? How should we deal with this? I'll go to you, Lynda, and I'll come back down to Autumn.
Sure. I think for leaders of businesses and organizations, we need to embed diversity, equity, inclusion training and opportunities and capacity building. And it really just needs to be, I don't want to say mandated, but it needs to be a major part of any training and leadership process. It needs to be embedded, especially as we're addressing the societal context today, the polarized context. It's necessary. It's as important as any type of training. We really need to do that and do it in ways that create cross-cultural dialogue and understanding. I continue to be amazed after years in this work how much we're able to learn by facilitated conversations among people of very different dimensions of diversity and very different lived experiences. It's incredibly critical. But I think it's up to all of us. How are we able to ensure that these opportunities exist from frontline staff all the way to the boards of directors? So as we start looking at some of the places where power is found, that oftentimes they need the training just as much as any frontline staff. So I say embed it into organizational practices, policies, procedures, and address it. And as Autumn stated, start by making sure that people know it's going to be uncomfortable. And how are we able to be present in that space? And that space is precious, because think about what happens when these situations happen in society, and it could end up being as dramatic as a loss of life because of those type of microaggressions that can get out of hand. So make it an important part of the organization.
Yes, thank you. And Autumn, being with a Fortune 500 organization, should microaggressions and implicit bias be, should training be provided in the workplace?
Absolutely. And I will tell you that our CEO has taken it on firsthand. We not just having colleague resource groups throughout the organization. I mean, Pfizer's pretty large. We have 92,000 people worldwide, but I will tell you, this is becoming a very grassroots execution, if you will. We've had here where I am in Lake Forest, we've had some specific courageous conversations with leaders where they started the process. And it starts with top down, but it's supported by bottom up. And I will tell you that one of our main concerns, which sounds probably a little odd given our conversation today, but it's around healthcare disparity. We're talking very specifically within Pfizer about how can we change the venue, the conversation, the situation around healthcare disparity. Everything from, clinical trials not including certain people and why we don't include certain people, right? I.e. Tuskegee experiment, all the way to access and how that shows up in a community and what that means, especially in the United States where we have so many health issues with specific marginalized groups. So I think that's a part of it. I would also say that we really, as working people who are conscientious, need to ask the questions with people we have the relationship with, as Lynda said. If you have a question, and I don't know if it's just me, or I think most of the people I know are pretty open to questions that come about, or even a comment that comes about from a place of humility and education, as opposed to authoritativeness or assumed knowledge. I think that's so important, right? And it comes back again to the empathy point, that if we don't assume I don't know everything and I'm seeking to understand, that is the most important way to lead into some of these conversations. And again, being uncomfortable is kind of entry point, right? You know that you don't know everything. I don't know everything about Asian cultures, and I may ask a friend who's Vietnamese, okay, help me understand food and norms within your culture so that I can appreciate that more whenever you have a Diwali celebration, or when there's, a certain aspect of, whenever we all go out together or something of that sort. And it's having those one-off conversations and educating yourself and saying, I don't know what I don't know, but saying it from a place of true education and learning. Like I'm seeking to understand, not I know everything.
Well, Autumn, I think you hit a great point, and as Lynella began to maybe transition back with us, I know there may be a litany of questions that are out there, but you're absolutely right in terms of asking questions. Implicit bias and microaggressions in some regards can be relational. I mean, you build a relationship with someone that comes from a completely different culture and ethnicity, and you can ask questions. You're asking questions because you're trying to familiarize yourself and to get to the point where you're not offensive towards anyone else. And I will encourage us to not only have dialogue, but to have open spaces where we can ask these questions and to be able to, once again, self-awareness, knowledge, and understanding. I mean, really, that's building up our internal constituency in order for us to be much more culturally competent and relevant. So, Lynella, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we have plenty of questions. And by the way, Bill Court is the first person that asked the question, so he will get the book. Okay.
Excellent, Bill.
So the first question from Bill is, if one is curious about someone else's ancestry, what would be the proper way to ask about it?
So I'll jump in if I can, because I actually had a comment, Dr. Darren, on the back of your ask questions comment as well, that I think this probably ties in. I think that I totally agree with you that asking questions is important in relationship building and understanding. I do think that at times those questions are asked with an expectation that whoever you're asking them of has a responsibility to educate. And I think that is an undue burden often. I think that particularly in the wake of what was the American summer and the tragedies that we saw, as I have told Lynda in the past, I'm a lot of white people's Black friend, and I got a lot of messages in the wake of those events asking questions. So many of those questions could have just as readily been answered by Google. So I think that at times, yes, it is important to ask questions, but if you are seeking, the answers to those questions honestly, rather than seeking at times just an assuagement of guilt, perhaps you can get that knowledge elsewhere. In response to the ancestry question, I think that context is important. I think that the question, where are you from? Where is your family from? In isolation, in a vacuum, is not in and of itself offensive, of course. Maybe you don't ask that question the first time you meet someone. Maybe that's not the first words that come out of your mouth, as though that will in some way determine how you understand, one's belonging in that space. Maybe that's a question you ask the third time. Maybe that's a question you ask over lunch. I mean, I think that context in so much of this language is important. Obviously the question itself is on its face innocuous, but once you add context, it could be damaging.
Can I just jump in and say that I think also some of it comes to us not being lazy in how we communicate. So instead of saying, where are you from? Or, what are your people? Who are your people, kind of thing. Asking someone a more specific question like, can you tell me about your ethnic background? Or, when you follow where I'm coming from, as opposed to like in the opening segment where he says, well, where are you from? And she says, San Diego. And, of course she comes from San Diego, and as do her people, so to speak. But if he had started off with, hey, tell me a little bit about your ethnic background, and then to Cole's point, in a context that makes sense, as opposed to just running across the trail, I think that's where some of those courageous conversations come, but also the empathetic and the empathetic answers come as well, because you're not being kind of confronted, for lack of a better word, with a question that feels like it's completely obtuse to the situation.
Okay, we're gonna have to get through a lot more questions, guys.
We'll
So,
run.
what's the best way to receive the call out of a microaggression that you did not mean to be negative, wish to correct, with understanding that I believe what I said was hurtful in the eyes of the other person, and it doesn't matter if I didn't mean it the way it was presented. Get that? So basically, she's saying, how do I call out that aggression if she didn't really mean it?
I think folks, again, have to, especially if it's in the workplace and you're going to have this relationship with this person, right? How are we able to just say ourselves, model, I know your intent was, you didn't mean to any negativity, but please know that that this may not be the way that you want to address this. I mean, immediately address it on both sides. On both sides, right? I know increasingly, and Dr. Anderson knows this, is we've been moving into a lot of these brave space conversations. I mean, we're on the journey now to become an anti-racist, multicultural organization, and we've let folks know there's going to be times that it's going to get uncomfortable. And so how do we just call it out, be honest, and set a framework by stating, I want to ensure that we move positively moving forward. Let's talk about this.
Great.
This is a good question. Do you have any specific advice for D&I bias training for non-office blue collar field workers?
Yes, for us, absolutely. We're looking at addressing all segments of society. And again, there are so many meaningful opportunities that start just by having conversations and creating spaces where people can talk about their experiences within their given context. You know, as Cole was stating, context can be everything. You know, and how are we able to make our DEI trainings accessible to all, especially for us as a YMCA, because, you know, some of those are going to include young people, you know, children. So how are we able to be straight to the point and ensure that we're addressing all people's needs?
And I'll jump in and say that sometimes that starts with not necessarily starting with race, which is always the hot topic in DEI, because DEI spans much more than race. So maybe it's talking about, if you're in, for example, a union environment, maybe it deals with rural versus city, or age, or gender as an entry point, which might be more applicable to that particular audience at that time and more understandable versus something that feels like it's always about race or ethnicity.
Yeah. And Lynda, and I will just add this, that if someone had made a statement that was a microaggression, they didn't intend to do it, we'll be doing that person a disservice if we did not bring it to their attention. And we can bring it to their attention in a non-threatening way, and really in a charismatic way, to let them know, hey, this may not necessarily be appropriate with a different person. So
the next question is, how impactful do you think American racial history post 1960s, 70s is in today's use of microaggressions? Did we move from the discussion of race with Malcolm X and MLK being public to one that we simply try not to talk about? In other words, as a white person, are we functioning out of fear of being perceived as racist? And ironically, are committing microaggressions simply because we weren't raised, being a millennial, to discuss race openly and instead talk around it? Do you want to dissect that for a minute?
it's a mouthful. Go ahead, Cole.
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I do think that there's a lot to that question. I think that you know, I reflect on this a lot, particularly now that I'm not in America, because just the many ways in which American history informs our present reality. And I think that in a lot of ways, the reason that we're seeing such division right now is a lack of understanding of just the extent to which that history informs our present reality. So I think it's much more than 1960s. Frankly, I think that you can go pretty far back and draw through lines from you know, a history of abuse in our nation, particularly as relates to Black people, and draw pretty direct lines to where it exists today, and sort of the structural inequities that exist today. In terms of what is the cause for talking around it, I think that in some ways I feel like the premise of that question is that you know what you're talking around, and I think that is so often not the case. I think that the way that our history is taught largely excludes the ways in which frankly America is guilty. America is culpable for its own, you know, bias, and so I think that I guess what I'm getting at is that it requires it requires a re-education. I don't know that it's an intentional talking around so much as it is being unaware of just how far we've taken it in the past, and just how sort of culpable we are in our own present day circumstances.
Okay. I'm going to ask this one last question because it's 12:59 and we just have to do some wrap up stuff. What I'd like to do is look at some of the other questions and see if we can respond to them via, written responses. The last question is, what strategies would you suggest for confronting coworkers about microaggressions? As a woman of color, it's very hard not to get upset and a little angry about microaggressions. I'd like to be able to practice tempering my emotions to be able to have a more meaningful conversation.
I can jump in on this one. I would say that, there's several ways you can react, right? You can let it go, which it sounds like is a challenge, and I appreciate that. You can respond immediately, which may not be the best course, or you can respond later. And I've said to, like, for example, at the end of a meeting, or I don't know, maybe if there's a break, I've just said, hey, Susie Q, I would love to talk with you just for a few minutes after the meeting, or, can we take some time to do a coffee? Because I just want to mention something to you. And that's where, I think you kind of come up with, this is how I want to confront this. And I'm going to ensure that I'm coming at it from a non-judging, hardcore confrontational way. And I'm going to try to lead with empathy, because I think this is where, as a person in the workplace, you can come forward as a leader and help to engage them and also grow their understanding of whatever that situation is, be it race or gender or whatever have you. And it may not even be towards you, it might be towards someone else. Like, I just want you to know, Susie Q, that you asking Janet about something and her transgender role just made me uncomfortable. And it's probably, et cetera, et cetera. So my point is, I think always kind of taking somebody, as I used to say, to the woodshed later, and not doing it out in public, and, sitting down and having that conversation, that courageous conversation. That's why they are courageous conversations. It's not just towards the folks who don't know, it's also with the people who do know, to the folks who don't know.
Well, just a couple, first of all, I want to thank everybody for participating. And I want to remind those on the call to complete the survey. We are giving away 3 books for the first 3 people that complete the survey, which will be wonderful. We'd love to get your feedback, because we want to make sure that the next ones are meaningful. We also want to remind you that on December 10th, we have our 5th and final webinar, and it's called Why Images and Words Matter, Cultural Competency and Messaging. So that should be a great one as well. It's actually on my birthday, so it'll be a great birthday present. And then we are going to include resources for you, including a link to the Harvard implicit bias test, as well as a toolkit from the YUSA, and also a kit from Pfizer that they've been using in their organization. And it has all the resources around what kinds of things you can, formal trainings, what kinds of things you can read, books, movies, all of those things that will allow you to create more awareness. So thank you all. Darren, would you like to have the last word? I'm going to give it to you.
No, thank you very much, Lynda, for pulling us all together, and Cole and Autumn, and as well as Lynda. Thank you all for spending time here with us today and sharing your personal and lived experience, but also you're leading your organizations. And Cole, you're making impeccable impact on our youth, especially those that are getting an opportunity to read your book. So I'd like to thank you all for contributing to this conversation and contributing to the greater good of our society.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. This is
Have a
great.
good one. Thank you.
Day.
Take care.
Audience, thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.
Hasta pronto.